Hello everybody, welcome back. I'm the Stretch Professor, and today we're going to be doing the support tier list for patch 12.8. As always, if you enjoy the content, please be sure to like and subscribe. Helps out a ton on the channel. Come by, check out the stream. We're back on YouTube now, so we're no longer on Twitch. We might stream like maybe once every couple of weeks on Twitch, just to kind of keep it active over there. But in general, we're going to be back on YouTube. So come by, check that out. I'm also starting a little bit earlier, around 10:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, usually going till about 2:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's a very friendly, chill community. We'd love to have you. And I'm going to be doing some afternoon streams as well. Maybe over the next couple of weeks, I'll try to start that up. It'll be a little bit more inconsistent because sometimes I have to do things during the day, just some adulting stuff. But I would like to be able to do some afternoon streams just to give people a chance to show up and hang out on a stream every now and then if that late time frame doesn't work for everybody. I know it's particularly hard on our friends in Europe, for example, who are like 6 hours ahead to have to get up at like 4 in the morning to watch the stream. So anyways, that's what's been going on with the channel. Okay, so let's go ahead and get back in here. And if you haven't seen my new setup yet as well, it's a little bit brighter. I'm working on that. It's because I have this new monitor and it's sort of side facing now, where my main monitor is over here and then I have the camera on the secondary monitor over here. So just a little bit of a new setup, but hopefully it's alright for you guys. Okay, well, let's go ahead and talk champions here. Now, as usual, disclaimer, I'm really aiming at kind of the platinum to silver with this. So if you play at a much higher elo, if you're playing at Diamond, Masters, Challenger, or if you're thinking about a pro meta, it's going to be a bit different. And obviously, if you're down in like bronze, iron, things like that, it might be a little bit different as well. But I'm trying to cover, a wide range of different capabilities, I guess we should say, and interests in solo queue with this. And it's, as always, it's also a mixture of statistics, but also just looking at the potential of a champion and where I think the meta might go and what might be underrepresented or overrepresented. So there's going to be obviously a subjective quality as well. I don't just rank them based on who has the highest win rates, for example, because again, I think some of that depends on how well a champion's potential is unlocked. And that's going to vary depending on how much experience someone has, the elo bracket, the matchups. There's so many things that can go into it. But I do my best to kind of give you a ballpark understanding of the power level of these champions. Okay, so first up, I still think Recon, if you get a lot of practice on him, if you can be good, I think he's one of the best overall to pick right now. And as usual, you probably know why I think that if you're a long-time fan of the channel. But if you're newer to the channel and you want to know about that, I do have a full Recon guide for Season 12 if you want to check that out. But the quick version of it is that he's just so versatile. He's a really strong engaged champion with not only his W, but also his R just allows you to gap close and potentially bait out flashes or other dash mechanics, such as like a Gale Force that someone might have, is you can run at them, pop your Shirelias, and they're usually going to have to use one of their abilities so that you don't touch them, and then after they use it, you can follow up with a W. You can also gap close with your E, jumping to allies, so when you have other mobile champions like a Lucian getting on top of them, or a Hecarim or whatever, you can gap close, press R, E, get to your ally, and then you can charm them that way. Or again, if they flash away, you can use your W. So it does take a lot of practice to understand the sequence of events or sequence of skills you should use, whether you should open with an RW or open with your W, then go for the R, or E first, then W, then R. There's all kinds of different ways you can do it. So just really understanding how to optimize each situation does take some practice. But I think once you get it, then he can be strong. Another aspect, not only is he good at engage, but he's also a pretty safe champion, particularly when it comes to warding. You can go deep into the enemy jungle, get some wards on those camps, the really powerful ward spots, warding blue, warding red, and actually get out, even if it's a somewhat dangerous time to try to ward that. Depending on the situation, you can still get caught, but it's a lot harder to get caught as Recon than it would be for something like a Leona or a Nautilus, because if you go in there and you get caught out, you're probably dead. But Recon can get out of a lot of tricky situations. It's also pretty hard to dive him, pretty hard to gank him for similar reasons. So, tons of mobility, really high engage potential, and really good itemization options that are relatively unique to Recon. So, as an engaged champ, Most of the time you have to build tanky stats so that you don't get blown up immediately when you go in. But as Recon, when you go in, you have the ability to get back out with your E most of the time. So that means you can afford to go for items that give your team more utility, but might make you personally just a little bit less tanky. So, for example, instead of having to go for something like a Thornmail or a Zeke's or a Knight's Vow, second, you could, in theory, get something like a Chemtech Putrefier, which is incredibly powerful. And in fact, that's the most common item. There are other items that have high win rates as well. It's a very common item, and it's one of the best Grievous Wound items in the game because it's only 2,300 gold, and you get that 60% from healing and shielding. But if you use Font of Life, which you're going to get most of the time because you're going to be going Guardian, then whenever you CC someone, they get that little font debuff over them, and if any of your allies attack them, then you get a heal, I think, for 4 seconds. And that heal counts as a heal coming from you. So it's not the same thing as lifesteal on them. And that's important because that triggers things like Chemtech Putrefier, like Ardent Censer, Staff of Flowing Water. Anything that says if you heal somebody, X effect happens can trigger off of that. So Recon is very good at getting that item versus, again, something like a Nautilus or Leona is going to have to get a Thornmail. It's probably going to be mostly single target. As far as the Grievous Wounds, it's going to be more expensive. So that's still an okay item on them, but I think Putrefier is potentially even better. So he has the option to get Putrefier, and he can get Shirelias most of the time, which when you have a bunch of sort of bruiser champions that want to run people down, and that's what a lot of the meta is right now, then Shirelias is incredibly powerful for making sure your teammates can also follow up on that gauge. And even just that motivate passive there, just being able to shield a couple of different allies, because remember your shield can apply twice, so being able to spread this movement speed out to different people is just really handy for allowing people to reposition. So the fact he can do Shirelias and Putrefier gives him a lot of team utility that Leona and Nautilus don't have. Now, his major weakness is that he's very vulnerable to CC, because he doesn't have really high base stats, and if you're getting these utility items, then you can get blown up a lot easier. So if you're playing against stuff like a Vhagar, a Malzahar, Poppy, people might be trying that out again on this patch, we'll see. Just anything that's either going to limit mobility and or has a really long stun time is going to be problematic. Morgana can be tricky, so that's difficult. Now, a lot of those types of abilities are a skill shot, and you do have a lot of mobility, so in theory you should be able to dodge the skill shots when you're running in with the Shirelias plus your ultimate going, like 800 movement speed. You got to be able to sidestep the Lux Bind or the Morg Bind or the Zerath, stun, whatever. You got to be able to do that if you're going to play Recon. So it is a skill check in a lot of matchups. You can get punished hard if you get CC'd, but he does have a lot of really good options. And you can still go for those tankier options if you want to. So if the enemy team doesn't have a lot of healing, you can still go Zeke's, and that's still going to be a really strong item on him. You can also go Knight's Vow or Zonya's in some cases. There are a lot of different options with him, depending on your team comp, depending on the game state. So extremely versatile, very safe champion. Allows for great vision control, really good at engage, really good at peeling. He's just a fantastic champion overall. His win rate's always going to be around 50% because he's really hard to play. I think he and Thresh are the two hardest supports to play for different reasons. But yeah, that's always going to hold him down a bit. So he's never going to be a 54% champ, but I think if you play him really well, he's really strong. Okay, next up we have Nautilus. Shouldn't be a lot of surprises here. You probably see these champions all the time in Pro, and this is one case where I think if you're playing at an optimal level, that the Pro meta, a lot of the picks for support also line up really well for solo queue, and that's not always the case, but I think that it is in this particular instance, because these champions aren't incredibly hard to play as far as like Leona and Nautilus. The hardest thing is just figuring out when you should fight and when you shouldn't fight. So just learning to analyze the situation, learning to look at your mini-map, time your engages well, make sure you have all your allies nearby, make sure you have good vision control of an area, just standard stuff that would apply to any engaged champ, but yet is hard to pull off. The lower the elo goes, it's harder because it's more difficult to keep up with the game state, to understand, okay, should we actually take this fight or not? right? To be able to tab and interpret the items and know if you're going to be able to win the fight, to make sure your teammates on the same page, pinging them, letting them know kind of the situation that you're going in. All of that's going to be a bit more challenging for an engage versus if you play something, like a Soraka or a Sona, you're probably not having to shot call, right? You're just kind of hanging back, healing, just peeling and protecting people, and you're letting other people shot call, which is that's a really good thing if your shot calling is on par with other people in that elo bracket, right? So if your calls are about as good as most other people's calls, then you're going to have a higher win rate on something like a Sona, because it just gives you so much guaranteed value. But if you think that you can learn how to shot call better than most other people, if you can find those engages other people are not going to take, if you can create those kinds of situations for your team, by getting proper vision control, pinging, leading them towards objectives, and things like that. So if you want to be proactive, if you think you can cultivate that skill, then I think that engage supports can be really strong. They're just going to be a little bit weaker by default because they don't have the guaranteed power. If you screw up the engage, it can actually be really bad for your team. Not only is it neutral in the sense of you're not gaining an advantage, it can actually be incredibly negative for your team if you make a bad engage. So higher risk, higher reward, basically, for something like a Nautilus and a Leona. But I still put them up there because the potential is through the roof on these champs. They have so much CC. Now, Nautilus, people have been maxing the hook lately. I think they did nerf the damage on this a little bit last year, but it's still incredibly powerful. Pretty low cooldown for a hook, too, at 10 seconds. And you can use this for a little bit of mobility to rotate around the map as well. So you could hook into terrain and get out. Now, if you get the timing down on the Nautilus hook, you can actually get yourself out of CC with the hook if you time it correctly. So what I mean by that is if you get something like binded or stunned or whatever while your hook is in the air and it hits a piece of terrain after the CC, then it's still going to pull you towards that destination. But if you hit your hook first and you're going through the air and then someone dislodges you, then it's going to stop you from moving there. So it's kind of a little game of cat and mouse where you want to time that hook. If you're trying to run away from a gank or something, you want to time that hook for right when someone's going to hit you with a piece of CC, and then it'll pull you out of there. It's not quite the same, but it's similar to buffering a Tristana jump or something like that. So there is some skill there, but a lot of it is pretty guaranteed, and that's why I like the Nautilus, particularly the ult versus some of the other engaged champs, because you just walk up, you press R, and it's gonna hit somebody. Unless they have a Zanya's or a bubble, the lethality item that gives you the bubble, or Banshees, then you're gonna hit them with it. So it's really, really good overall. It knocks up multiple enemies, and it's basically almost a guaranteed kill whenever you land this. So it's really strong. You can just run around and just pretty much kill somebody, go back, buy something, get some more wards, rinse and repeat, kill somebody again, in another 40 seconds or something by the time you get out there. It has a very, very short cooldown at 120 seconds. And there are so many items now that lower the cooldown reduction on things, or the ability haste, right? Like you've got your locket, then usually you're going to go Zeke's after that. That's 40 ability haste right there. Then if you take Ulti Hunter, which I'm a big fan of going Zombie Ward plus Ulti Hunter on him, if you do that, then you can just get it to be really, really low on the cooldown. So incredibly strong engage, really big hitbox on this Q. It's so easy to hit people with this compared to something like a Thresh hook or a Pyke lance, because it doesn't require any wind up. It's just virtually instant that it just flies out and has a massive hitbox. So really powerful champion overall. The one downside to the hook is that it can't go through walls. So you can't get those surprise hooks on people over a river bush or something of that nature. So that is somewhat problematic, but otherwise it's pretty good. Now he is on the squishier side compared to some of the other tanks. The W is nice, but it's not going to offer as much defense as something like a Leona W typically. And with the current build, historically he has had a good wave clear with his E, but with the current build, you don't typically max the E, you max the Q, just because a big part is the mana cost. And this is something that I underestimated last year when I was trying to play Nautilus a little bit more, is this E is very expensive. It goes up to 90 mana, and the fact that you don't have a great way to get mana because your first item is going to be Locket, which has no mana on it these days. So that is a bit awkward. And your second item has a little bit with Zeke's Convergence. Now, if you're going to go for something like a Frozen Heart, or if you're going for the Glacial Augment build with Biscuits, you might be able to get away with maxing the E. The E benefit is the wave clear, and it does a lot more damage in team fights than the Q. But the Q does give you more opportunities to fish for engages, and it's a flat 60 mana at all ranks. So that's just really handy. And it does a lot of upfront sort of burst damage to somebody when you hit them. So it does 250 on the spot to a single target, versus the E is typically going to do less. There are some situations where you can hit the same target, like with multiple waves, and do reduced damage, but it's not as likely as being able to hit them with the hook. So anyways, that's why I have Nautilus up here. It's just really good engage, fat hooks, just amazing ult, one of the best support team fighting ults in the game. It's going to lock down a bunch of kills, and tanks overall have very good itemization right now. Locket did get nerfed, but it's still going to be incredibly powerful in team fights especially. And then Zeke's is pound for pound one of the most powerful items in the game as well. Because if you ever do the math on this item, a lot of the time, once you calculate the bonus health scaling and how much per level that it's doing, it's usually somewhere in the neighborhood of giving like 80 on-hit damage at level 9 or so when you might complete this item. You might complete it a little bit later, depends on how the game's going. But by the time you get this, it's like 80 on-hit damage, which I think is like 2,000 gold value. It might be a little bit more, a little bit less, but it's somewhere in that neighborhood of value that you're giving to your AD carry or a mage, right? It says ability hits also. So you can put this on something like a Cassiopeia or an Azir. Azir soldiers count as ability hits. So typically it will go on the ADC, but if you have something else that casts spells really quickly, you could put it on them as well. So it's an incredibly versatile item. You know, it gives you health, armor, magic mana, ability haste. It's got everything. I think it's like 110% efficient, something like that, even without the passive. And the components are great too. Like Kindle Gem is just a fantastic buy. Gives you the health, gives you the ability haste, and then Glacial's pretty good as well. So just really nice build path overall. And then you have kind of the same thing here. You got a Kindle Gem there. The Aegis is sort of whatever. It's not an amazing item, but it's all right. It's just really, and then as far as the third item goes, you can do Knight's Vow, which I think is a little underrated. Pretty powerful item, but you could also get Thornmail if you need that. You could get Frozen Heart in some situations. You could get Force of Nature in some situations. Now, this is a low sample size, but I will say people in my chat often recommend Frozen Heart, and they're like, you got to get this item, it's so good. But when you actually look at it statistically on most champions, it's just not that great. It feels like it should be good. 20% reduced attack speed is nice. 80 armor is good, but it's just that much mana is still overkill on a lot of tanks. Most like meta tanks have pretty good mana management in general, and you're paying a lot for the mana. Now the 80 armor is good, but it also doesn't have health on it, which is problematic because a lot of champions have some sort of health scaling on them, or at least it like the health multiplicatively works really well with resistances. So usually you want health on items, and the fact that it has no health is pretty rough. So there are some situations, obviously, if they have like 4 auto attackers on their team where it could be good, but you'll notice that it has a substantially lower win rate than most other items, even though, again, it's a low sample size, but I find that happens a lot. Anyways, good item, but in a lot of situations there might be better. Okay, Leona's another one. It's a very similar story to Nautilus in terms of the itemization, in terms of why I think that engaged supports are really strong overall, and also sort of explains why I value them higher than their win rate might seem. Leona has a particularly low win rate here at 48%, but again, I think this is mostly from the poor decision making of a lot of people trying to play Leona. Because she's balanced around pro to some extent, so high risk, high reward. I would say even higher risk than Nautilus, because Nautilus can kind of get out of situations with his hook if he needs to. And whenever he starts a fight with someone, he pulls them about halfway towards him. Versus Leona has to go all the way in towards them. So that means that if you commit to a fight, you're almost certainly not going to get out of it. So if it's a bad fight or your teammates just don't follow up or whatever, you're going to be in a bad situation. However, she does a lot of damage early on, and she can go through minions and through champions. That's something Nautilus has a little bit of a hard time with. Like, his hook can't go through people, his ultimate can. But she can go through anytime, anywhere. So that makes her a huge threat in the laning phase, particularly because you're never safe. Like, you can't just hide behind minions and do that little dance, you know, where you're back and forth, not letting them get the skill shot. She's always able to start that fight if she hits the E. So she can just stand up in front and sort of zone you off of that wave really easily. Now, Recon can kind of do that too. Recon's not as threatening as Leona is, though, because she has more CC early, and the damage built into her kit is higher than Recon's in the early game. She also has incredibly low cooldowns. Like, the base cooldown on this Q is 5 seconds. So you only need to put 1 point in that early on, and then the E can go all the way down to 6 seconds, which is pretty big. So her uptime, when you start factoring in ability haste, they're just almost going to be perma stun locked whenever Leona attaches to them. So incredibly low cooldowns, very strong, single target, lockdown CC. She's very tanky herself with the W, particularly in the early game because it reduces damage by a flat amount. So when the minions are hitting you when you engage, then it is taking away a huge percentage of the damage. Like 50% of the damage from the minions is not going to apply. So really, really strong in those situations. And then her R is on an incredibly low cooldown at 90 seconds. Now, Nautilus is a pretty low cooldown at 120. Recon's is 140 on his ult. But Leona's is 90. So you can always start that fight. Has really long range, too. It doesn't say it here, but I think it's like 1200 range. So it has further engage range than a Nautilus ult, I believe, is about 800 or 900. So she can really start that fight from a long distance away. Now, the problem with that is that you can dodge the ult. So if the enemy has Gale Force or they have dashes or flashes or whatever, they can potentially get out of it. So that is really annoying. But you can chain it together to make it difficult for them to get out of it. So if you go in, if you start with your E and then you stun them with your Q and then you hit them with the ult, you're going to guarantee the full chain. But if you're just trying to open with the R, which is usually easier, then it's going to be a problem. So she can excel against champs that don't have a lot of mobility. So something like a Sona, Soraka, Senna, Jinx, that type of stuff. But she's going to have a harder time against like Ezreal, Lucian, and things like that have the dash. So incredibly powerful, really aggressive early on, really tanky, lots of uptime, fantastic at roaming because your ult's pretty much always going to be up. So really, really good at making those kinds of plays happen. Also, she has an auto attack reset on her Q, so this is actually quite good for clearing wards as well. So it just allows you to knock out that ward almost instantly and just move on to the next target, which, again, not a massive deal in all situations, but definitely is a very nice quality of life. So Leona, dangerous, but if you can snowball with her, she's still going to be really strong. And then Sona, just to switch it up a little bit, I think is the queen of enchanters, especially after the nerf to Soraka, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. Lots and lots of value. Sometimes people ask me, well, what's the champion you recommend that I play if I really want to get out of bronze or silver, or if I have a new friend that's playing the game, like which champion should they be playing? And I almost always say Sona. She's got like nearly a 55% win rate right now. And the big story here is it's just guaranteed power. Like, it's really hard to mess up Sona. Unless you're dying a lot, then she's going to be effective, right? So Sona's all about just spamming those auras. So the more ability haste that you get, the more you can spam the auras. And these give out really powerful effects. Like, it gives your entire team, you know, bonus on hit damage, or gives them a little bit of a heal and a shield. And this might look small, but it actually adds up in a 5v5 team fight. If you can touch like 3 people with this. Even once this is maxed out, that's a 375 shield, and then you're getting a 210 heal for that before scaling. So you're getting to like 550 or 600 baseline healing and shielding per cast, and it's going to end up with now it says it has a 10-second cooldown, but you got to remember that you get extra cooldown reduction on this for free with the R, or with the passive. Something still gives you really low cooldowns on this, and then you also have ability haste. So realistically, this typically gets down to like 4 or 5 seconds in the mid game, and it still has 30% AP scaling per person that you shield, and then 20% per person that you heal. So again, in that situation where you're shielding 3 people, that's a 0.9 ratio, and then you always heal 2 people, yourself and one other person, that's another 0.4. So you're talking like a 1.3 AP ratio there. And when you combine that with something like a Moonstone, which is going to increase your healing by 30%, and then that can compound with stuff like Revitalize, or if you have more plus healing and shielding from something like a Redemption, it just has insane scaling. So she's basically the queen of, I think, or certainly one of them, the queen of 5v5 team fights. So if you can hang out in the back, not die, protect people, and just spam these auras, it's going to be almost impossible for you to lose a fight if it goes on for like 5 seconds or more. So unless someone gets blown up immediately, Sona's going to be incredibly powerful. And there's almost no counterplay to that. Like, they can get grievous wounds if they want to, but it's not going to affect your shield. And you still give out like a pretty good movement speed buff with your E. You still have your ultimate. Which is pretty good team fighting tool. So she just has a lot of stuff going on there. Guaranteed power. You don't have to make decisions about when to fight or when not to fight. You just try to set up vision as best you can, rotate around the map, and just win 5v5s. She's pretty good in lane, especially if you're not against a hard engage champ, because you don't have a skill shot on your Q. So you can just hang back and just spam your Q over and over again. Just proc area on them. If you take Scorch, you can proc that too. You can also go for the scaling if you think you want to go later in the game with Gathering Storm. But it's just incredibly annoying that she's just constantly spamming this Q on you and just dealing chip damage after chip damage. So if you don't have sustain, it's going to be a problem. And definitely if she can sneak in an auto attack every now and then, if she gets a power cord auto on you while you're trying to last hit under tower or something like that, it starts to add up. It does quite a bit of damage. So with the nerf to lifesteal items a few patches ago, that makes Poke even more valuable, and her healing even more valuable as well in the laning phase. So she's very well positioned, particularly for silver, gold, bronze type of games, and even above that she's still going to have a high win rate. So if you don't really want to worry about thinking about engages or trying to read situations, and you just want to have that guaranteed power no matter what, Sona's going to be really strong for that. Okay, Nami. Nami's still pretty good. I don't remember what her win rate is, but she does combine really well with several champions. So she doesn't have like a super high win rate right now. I think they buffed something about her a few patches ago, although I can't remember precisely what this is. I think they buffed her passive. Didn't they make it 45 movement speed? I can't remember. They buffed something about her a few patches ago. And she's good if you have an aggressive lane. So I have her up here because Lucian, I think, is super popular right now, and that's usually her best partner in lane. And the reason why is the double shots. So whenever Lucian triggers those double shots, if you put an E on somebody, then it's going to trigger that twice. And if you take Electrocute, which doesn't look like that's super meta right now on her, but for a while people were taking Electrocute, and those E procs were triggering Electrocute. So it's a lot of damage in the early game. If you land that bubble, it's a really good kill threat tool, especially for an enchanter. Most enchanters like Sona, Soraka, Seraphine, Yumi, they don't have kill shots in the laning phase, but Nami kind of does. If you land that bubble and then you're able to hit them with a W for a really good trade and then put the E on your AD carry, you're probably going to be able to run them down, and if you don't kill them, you're almost certainly going to get a summoner out of them. So really good kill shot. It's a bit awkward because it's not like a line skill shot. You have to hit the exact spot, kind of like a Ziggs bomb. So that is a little weird. It does take some getting used to, but it is incredibly powerful if you land it. And later on in team fights, you can actually hit multiple people with this as well. So you could potentially get a 1.5 second knock up on 2 or sometimes even 3 people if they're all clumped up together. So that's really good. And then later on, she can help manipulate sort of how people are moving around in fights. So whenever you hit people with your W, your E, or even your R or your Q, it gives them that extra movement speed. People forget that. If you're really far behind a fight and you have an ally trying to run someone down, you can hit your own ally with this Q and it will speed them up. It doesn't always come up, but it's a neat little trick you can do to increase the movement speed of someone. If your W and E are on cooldown and you're not going to be in range to hit the enemy with the Q, you can hit your ally with a Q. And then also, whenever you hit them with the R, it doubles the movement speed of any allies that it passes through. So if you throw this through your allies from the back line towards the enemy, then they're going to get double the passive, which forgot what it's like 180 movement speed or something crazy like that. So anyway, she's incredibly powerful, good trading. The downside to Nami is she does have that lane dominance, she does have the kill potential, but she doesn't scale as well. She doesn't have really good AP scaling on most of her abilities. It's okay. She only has 1 healing and shielding ability, so it's not going to be that great as far as like getting value out of Moonstone. And she does have really low base stats and not that many escapes. So like she can kind of speed people up with the W, the E, that type of stuff, but it's a little more limited. Like a lot more of it just doesn't hit as many people as like Sona auras, and the cooldowns just aren't as low to keep up with something like a Soraka. And she's potentially a little bit more vulnerable depending on how you build those champions. So she's really an early game choice, right? If you want to hard stomp early but have some enchanter options later, she's good. So she does utilize Mandate pretty well. You've got the Ionian boots, which are strong, and then Staff of Flowing Water is an okay option to apply ability haste to people. You can also do Ardent Censer. So she does have some options. The problem is these items are not in an amazing state right now, in my opinion. Like, they are good for fights, but the big problem is they have no defensive stats on them, and there's a lot of burst damage in the game right now. The Mythics brought a lot of extra damage. You have a lot of the runes doing quite a bit of damage right now. There's a lot of damage. And so you can get blown up really easily if you don't have health, armor, or magic resist on an item. So it better be insane value if you're picking an item that doesn't have those. But this also doesn't have ability haste, which is key for enchanters because your stats are so low that it's very inherently risky to play most enchanters. So you need something to pay off for that risk. But if you can't cast abilities faster, then there's less payoff. It's like, why are you playing this? Why are you playing this champion when you can get when you get Staff of Flowing Water, Ardent Censer, it has no ability haste on it, so you can't do things as much, right? When you could play something like a Leona or a Nautilus, and their items are going to have 20 ability haste on them. When you think about something like a Zeke's, which is very common, and they have better stats, they have better CC, better engage. It's tough. It's tough to justify why you would want something like this. I mean, the main reason, again, is early lane dominance and being able to take an aggressive item like an Imperial Mandate to try to, again, kind of double down on that early to mid game and find a lot of extra value. So that's just one thing right now that they have really kind of nerfed these items. So they're still good, especially in like 5v5 situations late game, but the payoff for the risk is not quite as much there as it used to be. Okay, and then we have Senna. Senna's still really strong. Now, I haven't played her a ton, but she has had a bit of a resurgence. I don't know if they nerfed her the last couple of patches, but I still think that she's really good against Recon. I have a pretty low win rate against her overall. But she does provide really strong harassment in the early game. She's got a heal. She has an engage, sort of, with her W. She has some utility with her E for the movement speed, the cloaking, all that kind of stuff. But she also has really good scaling. So she has, like, enchanter-like properties, but also scales into a pretty formidable AD threat late game for a support. They also lower the cost on Umbral Glaive to 2,300, which is an incredibly powerful support item. Because it gives you so much extra vision control, especially if you take Zombie Ward. It's so strong. It's 54% win rate if you pick that first. And so I think you should pick it first. You are going to be squishier. You're probably not going to do quite as much damage. But just being able to control the vision, it's just insane. It's like you have 2 extra sweepers or something when you have that, because it's on such a low cooldown. It's like 35 seconds. I think most sweepers, I think they're like 70 seconds in the early game. So it's just incredibly powerful for vision control with pretty good stats to boot. I think it's over 100% efficient, including lethality, and lethality is a really under budget stat, so you get a lot more value than it appears out of lethality, especially in the early game. So incredible buy there. And then as far as second items go, Muramana is pretty good. Most people are kind of moving towards Eclipse as your mythic eventually. So she has a lot of nice tools, good harassment in the early game. It looks like people have kind of moved away from the tank-ish sort of build with like Divine Sunder, but it still has an okay win rate. So yeah, good scaling champion, nice harassment in the early game. She is going to be vulnerable to flanks and ganks in the late game. Again, your CC is not insane. Like you have a W, which is okay. Your protection is not that great. You do have the Q, which is okay as far as a heal. You have your R. So you have some tools, but it's mostly just that scaling AD damage, the very strong vision control, if you can maintain control of an area, right? So you don't want to be going out by yourself late game looking for wards without backup, because you're going to die if you get caught, right? Versus with someone like a Recon or one of the tanks, you might be able to get away or at least stall for your team to come and help you out if someone jumps on you out of a bush. But with someone like Senna, you're probably just dead. So really strong scaling option, a little bit on the risky side, but a good mixture of Enchanter plus lane dominance plus sort of an AD scaling option if that's what you want on your team. And then we've got Lulu. Win rate is okay. Ban rate is always extremely high because so it's 21%. I guess her win rate's not amazing at 49%. But I would say that Lulu is more comp dependent. I think she's one of the first champs here that I would classify as being significantly dependent on your own comp, because you really want a champion that benefits heavily from attack speed modifiers, because your W gives a ton of extra attack speed. I think it's 35%. But the big one is your passive ends up giving out something like 80 on-hit damage-ish. It's about the same as like Zeke's on-attack damage. Now, this does not apply to spell hits, though. It's strictly auto-attacks. It can scale to do even more than that late game. But around like level 9 or 10, it's probably about 80 damage. And so you want someone who benefits from the attack speed from your W, but also benefits from the on attack, which means they're going to be building a lot of attack speed themselves. So this typically means she pairs really well with like Kog'Maw, Twitch, Jinx to some extent are probably the 3 best ones. There can be some other ones as well, but those are kind of the 3 most notorious ones. If you can pair Lulu with one of those champs, it's going to be really strong. They have to be able to dive your backline or they're just going to lose, especially Kog'Maw. It's like notoriously really, really good with Lulu. But if you pair her together with something like an Ezreal, who's not going to be, auto-attacking that much because your picks is not going to apply on his Qs because it specifically says on attack, not on hit. So you're going to be losing a lot of value there. Now, like Shirelia's into Ardent is pretty common with her, just allowing for that reposition. You can do Moonstone, but you only have 1 shield with your E that would benefit off of the Moonstone plus healing the shielding, because your R counts as an infusion of health. It's not an actual heal. So it's not reduced by Grievous Wounds, but at the same time, it's not going to benefit from plus healing and shielding. It's not going to benefit from Moonstone. So, it's just something to consider. So Lulu is basically, if you really want to amplify a single target, she's going to be your person. And if you want to deal with divers and assassins, she's also pretty good into that. So your R, with that instant infusion of health, is going to be very good against a diver. And the W, the polymorph for 2.25 seconds, is also going to be incredibly powerful against non-tanky types of champs. that are in there. Now they can still move while they're polyed, but it's still incredibly good. Okay, now poly, I don't think that counts for Zeke's. I'd have to double check that. There's some item or some interaction I remember, or no, maybe it was Glacial Augment. It was one of those things where it's like something has to be like movement impaired or like disabled or something like that. But because they're not actually movement impaired, they're just silenced, disarmed, and slowed. It doesn't trigger one of those things. It was probably Glacial, so that was a little awkward, and that CC doesn't work that way. But anyways, still a good champ if you have that hyper carry ADC or like a Master Yi or just something else where you want to really amplify them. She can be a good choice for that. So incredibly overwhelming, feels overpowered in certain matchups though, and feels less so in other matchups. Okay, Bard, and I'll speed it up a little bit because I don't want this to take too long, but I do want to be, somewhat thorough just because I haven't done a tier list. I don't think I had to do one last patch because my computer was down. But Bard is getting a little bit of a buff on this patch. He's doing more damage off of his chimes, and I think the base heal on his W is up a little bit. So he's okay. I mean, the big problem with Bard is there's so much mobility in the game right now. So many dashes, a lot of champions kind of moving towards Gale Force after the nerf to Shield Bow a little bit more, and just kind of how the meta is shaking out. There's a lot of Gale Forces sort of going around, and that's really obnoxious because then they can dodge your R. So that's kind of annoying. The roaming on him is still good. They did nerf Dead Man's Plate a while ago. I don't remember exactly what they did to it, but that's another core item on him. So we'll see how it pans out. He's not horrible. I think he's okay as far as win rate goes. He's just weird. He is pretty high skill cap because you have to understand when you should be roaming, and because you have to like go get your chimes and like what you want to do with that. So if you want to try to make a play middle, or if you want to rotate back down to bottom, or just take a back timing after getting the chimes. So it just adds an extra level of macro consideration that most other supports don't have to deal with. So if you can do that well, and if you can find the geometry on his tunnels and find like creative gank angles, that's also good. So he just requires a little bit more sort of thinking about his positioning and how you want to manage the macro. But he's good if you can do that. The main thing in the laning phase is like he's kind of squishy, and he can get engaged on and just blown up very easily. He's just very conditional. If you land the stun, it is quite good, right? It's a pretty big stun with your Q, but if you miss that, you're going to be incredibly vulnerable. Like, your E doesn't do anything in an all-in fight, your W barely does anything in an all-in fight, your auto attacks are, like, pretty good, your Q is pretty good. So, early game, if you get a stun and you hit them with a few meeps and an ignite, you can apply a lot of pressure, but something like a, Nautilus or a Leona, once they hit level 3, are going to be extremely threatening. Or you might also just get poked out by something like a Sona or any of the mage champions. So he doesn't really, I feel like he doesn't dominate a lot of matchups, but he can be okay if used well. So he's got a lot of potential, but pretty high skill cap, kind of like Recon and Thresh. Blitzcrank, still pretty good overall. He's going to be less effective against things like a Leona or a Nautilus or a Recon. So not amazing against kind of my top 3 picks, but against a lot of other picks, he's pretty good, right? So if you can hook a Nami, Sona, Senna, Lulu, that type of thing, he's going to feel really powerful. But late game, if they have a lot of tanks, or they just have really good vision control and you just can't find hooks, or if people just get bubbles, right? If they get the Edge of Night or Banshees or whatever, you could have a hard time finding kills. So, and he doesn't do anything else. He's extremely one-dimensional. So if you are a newer player and you do want to play something that has a really powerful engage, but you don't want to take the risk of trying to decide when you want to commit the entire team to a fight, you're worried that you might pick the wrong fight, Blitzcrank's a good choice for that, because you don't have to commit. If you miss the hook, it's whatever. Like, you are vulnerable, until your hook is up. The enemy knows they can come into you, but at least you're not going into them, right, into a bad situation. So it's easier to just kind of throw a hook and then run away and just wait on your cooldown if you want to. So he's pretty simple for an engaged champ, but the price of that is you're not as multifarious, right? You don't have as many different options. you're not as strong in a 5v5 team fight because you have really long cooldowns and just don't bring a lot of utility. So he is what he is. He's very one-dimensional, but it's a very strong dimension to be in if you can land a lot of the hooks. Okay, then we have Morgana. She's very comp dependent as well, I would say. She's a really good sort of anti-CC champion. So she has her Black Shield, which is incredibly obnoxious against a lot of engaged champs like Leona, Nautilus, Recon. Makes people immune to CC. And then she also has a bind that can be a 3-second bind if you do try to go into her, which obviously is going to be really damaging for most champions, right? It's probably you're going to die if you get hit by a bind and you don't have an answer like a Mikhail's or a Cleanse or something. So that's good. Her W really doesn't do anything outside the laning phase, just for kind of pushing waves. And then her R is like okay. It's mostly just a deterrent, right, for people that are trying to dive your backline. They're just going to have to run out unless they want the stun. So usually it just forces them to retreat. So it's okay. They had talked about maybe changing her around a little bit. I think if they gave her W grounding, kind of like Cassiopeia's W, that would immediately make her incredibly strong. They might need to nerf her in other ways, but it'd be interesting if they gave her something like that. Like maybe lowered the cooldown on the Q, change the binds to be like 2 seconds max. I don't know. I don't know how they would change her. Like she's fine. She's just a counter pick right now, and she has extremely long cooldowns for the most part. Like I think her shield is like 25 seconds or something, so you get one shot at that. So it's like she has incredibly powerful tools, but they're very limited. Like you get like one of them per fight, maybe two, if you have a lot of ability haste on the Black Shield. So she's okay, like, but I would not blind pick her. I would make sure the enemy has some kind of CC, and preferably that you have someone that's worth protecting, right? That you have some kind of carry that's going to get a lot of benefit out of not being able to get CC'd. So something like a Katarina, something like a Master Yi, Twitch, Jinx, these types of champs are pretty decent picks with Morgana. Caitlyn has been a popular pick with Morgana as well, although Caitlyn's sort of fallen out of the meta a little bit. You do have the bind into trap dynamic. You could also probably do that with Jhin and be pretty effective. So, anyway, she's all right. And then Janna. Janna doesn't have as much guaranteed power, I would argue, as something like a Sona or even a Lulu in the right situation. But she does have a lot of peel, which is really nice. So she, again, is more of a situational pick where if you have a really strong backline, if your backline is stronger than theirs, so if it's like you have Jinx, they have Ezreal, something like that, then Janna's going to be really good, particularly if you have very high AD scaling, because her shield applies like 50 AD, or gives a buff of like 50 AD on champions who otherwise... I don't know where I was going with that, but it gives them 50 AD, which is good. So especially if they have AD and they crit, because critical strike is another modifier on AD that makes it even more powerful, then she's strong. So on your traditional, like, Jinx, for example, that's going to build crit, it's going to get something like a Kraken, she's going to be really good. And specifically, anything that requires kind of mobility that's interruptible to get to your backline, she's going to be good against that. So something like a Leona specifically, a Nautilus can be pretty good. If you've got like a Zach or a Jarvan or something like that trying to dive your backline, she can be pretty good. The downsides to Janna are that you do have to have good reaction times, good ping to make full use of her Q and her R to make sure you're getting good peeling out of that. She doesn't have much sustain in the early game, so you can get poked out, and your shield is on a very long cooldown in the early game. So like Lulu's shield is 10 seconds, Janna's I think starts at like 18 seconds. Your shield also decays over time. I think it's one of the only major shields left that decays. Like Lulu's falls off relatively fast at like 2.5 seconds, but you get the full value up front, versus Janna's decays, so you very rarely get full value out of it. So that is a little obnoxious. Also, if the shield breaks, they lose the AD. So that feels bad too. Versus with someone like Lulu, if you shield somebody and the shield breaks, they still have the picks attached to them for the extra damage. So I just think Lulu is positioned a little bit better than Janna in a lot of matchups right now. but Janna is good if you want the extreme peel just to protect a really strong backline, especially champions that have really high AD scaling. Pyke is another one that has been coming up. I think a lot of what has made him strong recently is Umbral Glaive. He's a very good glaive user because he can clear wards safely and efficiently. Because if anyone ever tries to come up to him, he can get away really easily with his W, with his E. He's a very slippery champion, so you can get in there, get those deep wards, keep track of the enemy, clear the enemy wards out. He's pretty strong right now. He does have a pretty powerful hook. There's definitely a chance. I mean, some people might have him all the way up in S. I could see him being higher in A. The major thing with Pyke is you need to be playing against a lot of champions that have really low health so that you can maximize that ult because it's a flat damage rather than a percentage. So if you run into tanks, then that can be problematic. Also, there's a lot of movement speed out there, like the Gale Forces, the dashes, all of that, and so that can make it hard to hit your ult if they still have some kind of dash up, and that's a lot of your power. So he is pretty good in kill lanes, all in. If you land that hook and then get the stun, you are going to get the kills, but it's really single target assassination is what he excels in. So in a 5v5 team fight, it's going to be a little bit tougher. He just doesn't have as much consistent CC as something like a Nautilus, Leona, or Recon, but he does have really good pick potential, and he does have the ability to generate a lot of gold with his ultimate, so he can actually build multiple items pretty quickly and snowball really hard if he does get ahead. So good snowball pick if you want to kill lane, and also comes with exceptional vision control and really strong roaming as well. Lux, I still think Lux is the best mage that you can have in the bottom lane right now, and the big reason for that is if you get used to the timing on her E, it's very long range, it's safe, it's a really strong way to apply pressure in the early game, and most importantly, it gives vision. So in that mid to late game, you can throw that E into bushes from a very long distance and get vision and see if anyone's there. So it's a lot less likely that Lux, if you're playing it well, is going to get caught out in the late game. And that's one of the biggest struggles of non-tanks, is trying to get vision in the late game when you don't know where the enemy is. It's just so risky, and things like Sona and Soraka are just going to be prey to any sort of bush gangs or highly mobile assassins or anything like that. So Lux is a little bit better at dealing with that. She does also have a long-range bind, which is pretty nice if you get that kill, or if you do get the bind. So it's not as long as Morgana, but it's pretty long. It's like 2 seconds. You're only putting 1 point in it, which is effective. And it's a very low cooldown ultimate that does quite a bit of damage and has a huge amount of range. So that is really handy in a lot of different situations. So I do think that Lux can be good in a lot of matchups, particularly at sort of the silver and gold level. And then we have Yumi, and Yumi is an interesting option, kind of Lulu-esque in the sense that you really want to play her into certain matchups with certain allies. So anything that scales really hard, and particularly anything that can go invisible and snowball, is really good with Yumi because she can attach and then she's invisible too. So playing her with something like a Twitch is historically, I think, the best thing to play her with, but also like an Evelyn out of the jungle. Trying to think of what else. Something like Blue Cane maybe that can just run around and has a lot of mobility. So if you're not disrupted, if you can just pop off in the laning phase and just consistently land auto attacks to get that bonus shield and to keep your mana topped off, she's really pretty decent in the laning phase. Like those Qs, when you combine that with Aerie or Comet, can do quite a bit of damage. In the early game, your heal is reasonable. It costs a lot of mana, but it's a pretty good heal compared to something like a Sona or a Soraka in the early game. And then late game, of course, the main sort of benefit of Yumi is you can't be picked off. You just attach to somebody, and as long as they don't kill that person, or if it's a 5v5 fight, you can keep hopping around to other people, then she's not going to die. So that's a really powerful, unique mechanic to her. And because you attach to other people, you don't have to buy boots, so that's going to save you an additional 950 gold, which means you can snowball even harder into your second items. You can get the Moonstone plus Redemption or Moonstone plus Ardent Censer, or whichever item you want to get. So really strong, super hyper scaling champion, especially if you have a team that just has a ton of options. Then she's going to be incredibly strong. Very guaranteed power there. So you don't want to play her with like only one or two carries on your team and then a bunch of like tanks or just sort of role player champs. You want to make sure that you have hyper carries, so that if one or two people fail but one person gets fed, you can attach to them and just help that one person, basically 1v9, 2v9 the enemy team with your help. So yeah, really strong champion overall. Last few champs, and I know we're almost out of time here. I don't want to take it over an hour. Thresh, still pretty good. He did get nerfed a little while ago. I'm not entirely sure why he's not great into this meta. I think his matchups into tanks aren't phenomenal, and also into mages aren't phenomenal. He's okay into enchanters if he can snowball early, but he's just a super high skill cap champ that doesn't have a lot of guaranteed power. So if you're a really good Thresh player, you can definitely still make him work, but it's not as good as it used to be. I gotta get the cat blanket here so the cat can jump up here so he doesn't tear up the arms of the recliner. But anyways, Tahm Kench has a low win rate, but I still think there are good situations for Tahm Kench out there, specifically with someone like Jinx or other hyperscalers. He does have pretty good all-in threat in the laning phase, and the itemization is like okay on him. But kind of like Morgana, you just want to make sure that your protection is getting good value with your R. It just has a much longer cooldown than Morgana's Black Shield. So he's okay, particularly against a bunch of divers, particularly if they have long cooldowns on their engages. He's pretty good. So I would, consider picking him into something like a Nautilus or a Leona if you want to do that. She still found the one little open spot that didn't have a blanket to claw it up. I guess where there's a will, there's a way, right? But Brand and Zyra are also pretty good. I mean, I could definitely see an argument for having them in A tier right now. They both do a lot of damage in the early game. They require a lot of gold to get their items, but if you can snowball with them, they are really powerful. They're kind of mid-range, so if you're against something like a Xerath or a Lux or a Vel'Koz, that can feel pretty bad because they're going to outrange you and outpoke you potentially. But Brand and Zyra can be good. Alistar's okay. He does have really strong engage. It's just his tools are a little bit more limited, I think, than Nautilus and a Leona, but he can be alright, especially if you can roam around really efficiently. You also have Karma, good lane bully, but I think falls off pretty hard late game. I would say if you just want to play somebody who bullies early but scales better, I'd probably just play Sona in most elo brackets, or maybe even Lulu, who has good speed modification and good steroids, and can also harass pretty well in the early game. If you're really into that, you could just put, 3 points in Q on Lulu and then switch over to shield or something like that. That's uncommon, but you could still get decent harassment out of Lulu if you really want to in the laning phase. So Karma's okay. Typically played with something like an Ezreal for a poke lane, but I personally think there could be better options. Poppy is an interesting one on this patch, just because she is getting a buff to her W. I think the cooldown is going down, so you can get more disruption there. And I think her R, if you knock someone away, it's like 3,500 range now. It's really, really far, and it's a lot faster. I'd be interested to see sort of what her win rate is on this patch. She got her claw caught trying to jump off. It's okay. It's not amazing. It's not a great pick rate. So it's going to be a lot better for Poppy jungle or Poppy top, where she's already pretty decent. But as a support against mobility champs, against something like a Recon or a Nautilus, Leona, stuff that has to kind of gap close, I think she could be decent. I'm not 100% about that. Not entirely sold on it. But the fact she got buffed, maybe it's okay. Xerath, good harassment from a long distance. He did get that little bit of extra stun on this patch, so keep an eye on that. Maybe he could be even a little bit better. Soraka got a huge nerf on her healing. Maybe she still deserves to be A tier. She lost 2%. She's okay. I would just probably almost most situations just play Sona if you want to play something like a Soraka. And then the final one that I'll mention here is Swain. Now, there's a lot of stuff that changed about Swain. I'm not 100% about all of that. I thought that it was going to be bad. Some people were telling me it was going to be good. but, you know, based on what I've seen, he's got a 44% win rate with a 6% play rate, so people are definitely playing him. Now, that could be that people just don't understand how to optimize his playstyle, so it's kind of a wait and see, but for right now, you know, I thought it was going to be bad just reading it, and the statistics look bad, so I'm going to say it's not great, but maybe it'll improve in a patch or two if people can figure out an optimal way to play him. But anyways, that's going to be it. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to like and subscribe if you did. Come by, check out the live stream around 10:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time every night, and I'll see you next time. Have a good day.